What makes you great at story?
Oh, great. That's a good question. What makes me great at story? Okay, so I think what makes me great at story is that I understand story. And there's a difference between having an idea and having a story. And I think a lot of people get stuck in the idea phase, which basically means you have an element to a story. Like you might have a great character, you might have a great situation for you to put them in. There might be a great world that has that you've started to originate. But until you have every single one of those elements, you don't yet have a story. So me understanding what it takes to have a story helps me to help writers get to the place where they have a full story. And so I'm able to look at what they have and say, okay, so you've got a great idea, but now how do we make that into a story? How do we give this character some depth and then give them an actual goal so that they can have something to do during their story? Or how do we have this goal and give a character who would be great at actually making the goal happen, or the total opposite? They could never make that goal happen. So now their journey is going to be getting to a place of actually being able to reach that goal. So I'm always looking into it to see what elements do you have, what elements do you need, and how can we really flesh out what your full story is.
And is that because sometimes they're actually writing a story that's loosely based on them? Or no?
Sometimes I have dealt with a lot of writers who are writing something that is based on truth, and it's really easy to get stuck in that. And that's because when you're stuck in truth, you're stuck in trying to tell the truth. And I always say to them, go look at the actual films that are based on true stories and read that line underneath, based on a true story, right? Which means that you can't get hung up in what actually happened, because in most of our lives, every day is not entertaining. Even if you look at reality television, right? They have their cameras there for 12 hours a day and they're filming. But you at home are not watching 12 hours of them filming someone, because there's not enough entertaining stuff happening. So the producers are going to take all of that footage and then go home and craft a story, which is why you may then have people dressed in one way having a conversation, and the next 5 minutes, they're in another place having that same conversation. But we don't know, those conversations could have been months apart. But they built the story for us because we have to understand what it is that we're following. And so the same thing is true when it's in scripted form. Just because it's based on true story doesn't mean it's dramatic enough, doesn't mean it's entertaining enough. So we have to figure out, what's the story that you're actually trying to tell? Like, what's the root thing? And then let's put all the elements to it, regardless of whether it's the truth, and then let's tell the story. But I think in general, writing is one of those things that a lot of people don't understand has a skill to it, has a structure to it. So people wake up and say, I want to be a writer because I have this great idea. And I give the example of, if I were a 35-year-old man who had never played football a day in my life, never. And then I woke up one day and said, I'm going to go walk onto an NFL team. People would look at me like I was insane. So I give that same look when people just wake up and say, I'm a writer because I have an idea. It's like, you still got to go build that muscle. You still got to go to practice, right? By writing and writing and writing before you can get to a place where you can assume that you're going to have like a Shonda Rhimes kind of script, right? Just like I'm not going to wake up one day and just be able to be in the NFL. So I think people kind of get stuck in that place because it's creative. And so they think, well, there are no rules. Anybody can be creative. Yes, anybody can be creative. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have all the elements that you need for a story.
And that's a great point. And you talked about, based on a true story or whatever, based on. It's funny that you mentioned that, because there's at least 2 films right now, great films, but when I went back and read and did some research on the stories that they were based on, some very major parts were left out. Mm-hmm. And I was talking to David about it. I'm like, why would they leave this out? And I think you were saying that it's because maybe it just didn't fit into the arc of the story.
Yeah, it didn't fit into the story.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And the story has to be king. The writer cannot be pushing a narrative, even though sometimes you will watch things and obviously the writer is saying, this is what I'm trying to say, right? But some of the best art is giving you all of the information and letting you decide what they're trying to say, or you getting lost in, well, is it this or is it that? And you having to come up with your own decision about it versus the writer just sending you to it. So I often tell people the characters have to be making decisions based on who they are, not based on who you are. Right? So you may need for your character to get from A to B. And so you're saying, well, I'm going to have them do it this way. But would that character do it that way? Or are you just forcing them into doing something because you need to get them to the other end? So I'm hoping that that's the reason that they didn't put it in there. It just didn't work into the, to the arc of the story. And so if it was going to push the story in a different direction or show you a different side of the person that you didn't want them to see, you know what I mean? Because if you establish a character as being one way, and then they act in a way that's not within those bounds, you now have raised a question for your audience. So now your audience is going to be thinking for the rest of the film, well, what was that? Well, what does that mean? And how does that influence blah, 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 blah? And if it literally doesn't influence anything else and the character just absent-mindedly acted on the outside of themselves, that question never leaves. And now we might leave the theater going, there was just something about it, like maybe we can't put our finger on it. Some people might be able to say, well, it's because they did this. And that's why it doesn't make any sense to me. Most people won't really be able to put their finger on it, but they'll be thinking to themselves, there's something there that I just didn't understand. And it's because that character made a decision outside of what you told us he or she was. So sometimes it's best to leave those things out unless you are purposefully showing me that. So I gave an example to, I'm teaching an online class right now, and I gave an example to a student, and it said, if there's a woman who is ex-military, and she is fighting men, like physically fighting, right? And she fights 1, she fights 2, she fights 3, she fights 4. But when 5 comes, she freezes and she runs. Then that tells me there's something there. Something's going on with this particular guy. She just fought 4 other guys. Why didn't she fight him? Now, if it never comes back, so I understand why she didn't fight him, I'm going to have that question for the rest of the time. I'm going to wonder what that was. And so that might have been the first breadcrumb to teach us something between them, something from her past, something about him made her freeze and flee instead of fight. So everything within the film has to be working towards, that story. And if it's not, then just leave it out.
And you're right. It was 2 different films, and that was it. It made the character look different. Mm-hmm. Great point. Okay. Excellent.